If the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine has taught the collective West anything over the past few years, it's that limited stockpiles of high-end weapons just aren't enough to support large-scale war against a well-supplied adversary. The United States, maybe more than any other nation, has developed and fielded a long list of practically unparalleled weapons capable of traversing dozens, hundreds, or even thousands of miles, while leveraging low observable design characteristics and even onboard artificial intelligence to navigate contested airspace and locate far-flung targets. But high capability comes at a high cost, or rather, more than one high cost. Not only do advanced weapons like the AGM-158C long-range anti-ship missile, or LRASM, ring in at literally millions of bucks a piece, but because of their complexity, they're also produced in limited numbers. With only a few hundred LRASMs coming off Lockheed Martin's assembly lines each year, war games played out by groups like the Center for Strategic and International Studies simulating a conflict between China and the United States consistently show Uncle Sam running out of high-end standoff munitions like those within the first weeks, if not the first days, of such a fight. And of course, newly emerging programs like the Air Force Research Lab's Rapid Dragon effort, which turns cargo aircraft like the C-130 or C-17 into missile-packing arsenal planes, are literally based on the idea of launching a large number of standoff weapons into adversary airspace in very short order. In fact, you could launch an entire year's worth of Lockheed Martin's stealthy JASSM and LRASM cruise missile production in just one sortie using just 11 C-17s. To be blunt, we need cheaper options to supplement the extreme capability and extreme cost delivered by these high-end weapons. Missiles, or something similar that offer enough range to be launched from relative safety and sufficient guidance to find targets with a high degree of precision, but without the more expensive bells and whistles that have come to define America's higher-tier weapon systems. Now, some argue the answer is fielding even cheaper kamikaze drones, like Iran's Shahed 136, and I can absolutely understand the sentiment, but I think slightly more expensive cruise missiles are actually the better choice. Let's talk about why. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. One of Russia's Kilo-class diesel-electric attack submarines appears to have broken down off the coast of France, and while Russia claims that there's nothing wrong with it, reports from Russian social media and the tugboat that's currently towing it through international waters both seem to suggest otherwise. And I've been staying on top of this story with Ground News. Ground News is an aggregator that collects articles published by news outlets all over the world and sticks them all into a single easy-to-read feed that helps me not just stay on top of what's going on, but also to see right through most common forms of modern media bias. Right here on Ground News, I can see that 63 outlets have already covered this story, including at least 10 right-leaning outlets and 12 left-leaning ones. And it's pretty funny to see how outlets on all sides are framing this story around comments made by NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, who joked that since 1984, Russia's gone from the hunt for Red October to the hunt for the nearest mechanic. Now, left-leaning outlets ran headlines like NATO Chief mocks broken Russian submarine as it resurfaces off English Channel, while right-leaning outlets got in on the same fun with headlines like Putin humiliated as NATO chief makes brutal joke about limping Russian sub. And Ground News also gives you vital information about each outlet along with the headlines, like their political bias, their factuality rating, their corporate ownership, or any government affiliations. And I love the Ground News blind spot feature that shows me stories that are getting lots of attention in one political sphere but are being ignored in the other. It helps me make sure that I'm keeping my media intake balanced. Ground News is a big part of my research and my day-to-day news consumption, and it can be for you too. Just go to ground.news/sandboxx with 2 X's, or just follow that link in the description below to get 40% off the same Vantage plan that I use every day. Again, that's ground.news/sandboxx to get 40% off their Vantage plan that'll help you stay on top of things. Not all that long ago, I came on here and explained why calling weapons like Iran's Shahed 136 or Russia's equivalent, the Garand-2, Kamikaze drones, was more about media sensationalism and evoking buzzword-saturated fears than it ever was a weapons classification. The truth about these relatively low-cost and low-capability weapons is that they're really just badly performing cruise missiles that usually leverage lower-cost piston-driven engines than the air-breathing turbojets or turbofans that you'd find in more capable but similar cruise missiles. Now, that isn't to say that these drone missiles are useless. In fact, I could argue the opposite. The value in these weapons isn't derived from their capability, but rather from their low cost and simple manufacturing. According to Ukrainian military intelligence, Russia's ramped-up military manufacturing is currently pumping out maybe around 195 total cruise and ballistic missiles each month to support their war effort. And that includes everything from ship-launched cruise missiles like the Caliber to air-launched ballistic missiles like Kinzhal. But the Garand-2 is a much simpler piece of equipment, and as a result, Russian production lines are said to be approaching production numbers of between 170 and 190 of these kamikaze drones each day. Now, with those kinds of production numbers, you really could argue that it doesn't matter that these weapons are literally slower than your mom's Honda Civic, or that reports from the front show that only about 5% of them ever even reach their targets. But just to prove my point about how few of these weapons actually do find targets, in July of this year, news outlets around the world ran headlines about Russia's kamikaze drones getting through Ukrainian air defenses in, quote, record numbers, because Ukraine only managed to shoot down 85% of them that month rather than the usual 95%. Now, even that 15% success rate isn't exactly something to write home about, but during that window of time, Russia was launching as many as 728 Shahed-style drones and similar decoys into Ukraine at a time. So that 15% success rate still represented maybe more than 100 weapons delivering their 110-pound high-explosive payloads to Ukrainian targets in a single day. And that is enough to have a palpable effect on any battlefield. But it also undercuts some popular arguments about how cost-effective these low-cost kamikaze drones actually are. So let's talk money. Leaked emails show that Russia was paying as much as $290,000 per Shahed 136 or Garand-2 when they first started importing them from Iran. But in 2023, Russia forked over 108.5 billion rubles. That's about $1.75 billion to transfer the technology, equipment, and software over from Iran to stand up Russia's own production lines. And as a result, Russia was eventually able to drive the cost of these drones down to just 4.4 million rubles apiece, or just about 50,000 American dollars. And that does seem like a bargain. But if we assume an average 10% success rate for these drones, far better than usual, but not as good as Russia can manage at its best, well, that means you need to send 10 of them at any single target to ensure a hit. So, while the cost per Garand-2 may be as low as just $50,000, the cost per target struck becomes more like $500,000. And when you think in those terms, you can start to see how slightly better weapons at a slightly higher per unit price could actually end up cheaper in the long run. At 3 times that price, a $150,000 weapon that offers, let's say, a 30% success rate would ultimately be cheaper per target struck at an average of $495,000. The fact of the matter is, the number of weapons you launch just isn't as important to the outcome of a conflict than the number of targets you actually hit. And as I've said before, once you take a kamikaze drone like the Shahed 136 and add better propulsion and guidance systems so that it'll be, any good, what you've gone and invented is just a good old-fashioned cruise missile. And that is exactly what's led to what I've come to see as something of a low-cost cruise missile revolution in America's defense industrial base, with now a long list of new modular air-breathing drones and weapon systems heading to the market with prices ranging from just $150,000 to $200,000 apiece. And I recognize that $200,000 sounds like an awful lot of money to mere mortals like you and me, but in ordnance terms, that is downright cheap. An AIM-9X Sidewinder air-to-air missile costs well north of twice that much. An AIM-120 AMRAAM is at least 5 times as much, and a radar-hunting AGM-88G would set you back more than 30 times that much. That is to say that in terms of American defense expenditures, well, you could field a whole lot of cruise missiles at a $200,000 per unit price point. But before I dive deeper, I want to clarify my position a bit, because I'm not arguing that the United States could not derive any real value from weapons that are similar in form and function to the Shahed 136. As great analysts like Tyler Rogaways pointed out for the Warzone, there are indeed some benefits that these sorts of kamikaze drone cruise missiles can provide that a lower number of more capable cruise missiles could not. Maybe most notably, degrading adversary interceptor stockpiles. As Rogaway pointed out in his piece, US needs to be building tens of thousands of Shahed 136 clones right now. The fact that these drone weapons are pretty easy to intercept can actually be a strength, because as long as they're not being shot down by inexpensive close-range point defense systems, well, adversaries will be using much pricier and much tougher to replace air defense interceptors to bring them down, and that, in itself, could be argued as a victory of sorts. And to be clear, I don't disagree. And rather than seeing my arguments in favor of low-cost cruise missiles as an opposing point of view, I'd suggest viewing it as an incremental step or complementary strategy. Rogaway envisions hundreds of thousands of these weapons being produced in 2 primary trims, one with a maximum range of around 1,000 miles and another with a range of 2,000, but argues that they should otherwise be as simple and inexpensive as possible to manufacture. And to be clear, these are both greater ranges than you'll get out of any of the publicly disclosed low-cost cruise missiles being fielded to date. The low-cost cruise missiles being developed today largely offer ranges of around 500 nautical miles, which is around 575 miles or about 926 kilometers for those of us who don't wear an eye patch to work. And they carry a similar-sized payload of many Shahed-style drones at right around 100 pounds. Now that means these weapons do offer much less range than a standard Shahed 136, which may be able to reach twice as far, but the cruise missiles can compensate for that range deficiency simply by leaning into America's pre-existing strength, namely its massive air power apparatus. While some of these cruise missiles, like Anduril's Barracuda 500M, have already demonstrated their ground launch capabilities, it is still no secret that these weapons are primarily meant to be air-launched, with many even going further to specify that they were optimized for palletized deployment. Now, in this context, palletized deployment is all but certainly in reference to concepts like Lockheed Martin and the Air Force Research Lab's Rapid Dragon program, which a lot of you already know is aimed at using America's massive fleets of logistics aircraft, like the C-130 and C-17, as standoff bombers, with a single Hercules capable of deploying as many as 12 long-range cruise missiles in short order, and the larger C-17 able to launch as many as 45. Now, the concept behind Rapid Dragon is pretty simple. The weapons are loaded into a palletized launch system that's rolled out the back of the aircraft like any old cargo drop. Once in freefall, parachutes open to stabilize the pallet and orient the weapons properly for launch, and then a control box on the pallet launches each weapon or drone system as the pallet drifts in the wind. Now, Rapid Dragon was originally designed around Lockheed Martin's high-end family of JASSM, or Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff missiles, which currently consists of the Extended Range AGM-158B JASSM-ER and the costlier but more broadly capable AGM-158C long-range anti-ship missile. But many of the low-cost cruise missiles making their way toward service today were also designed with this specific delivery method squarely in mind. And just as importantly, I've learned from my discussions with Lockheed Martin's Rapid Dragon team that the launch platform and its systems are, generally speaking, aircraft and even weapon agnostic. That is to say that Lockheed's pretty confident that they could build Rapid Dragon-type palletized launch systems for just about any air-launched missile to be deployed from just about any aircraft that can fit a pallet of missiles inside it. Of course, any such launch could also be bolstered by other aircraft launching these or similar weapons the good old-fashioned way, and surface-launched versions of these same weapons and drones can also be used in such an attack, provided you could position launch assets safely to do so. With about 575 miles of range offered by high-end missiles like the JASSM-ER, as well as low-end weapons like the Barracuda 500M, Comet, and others, these weapons can be deployed from well outside the reach of adversary air defenses, and the right combination of weapons and drones can make for an incredibly potent 1-2 punch of kinetic and electronic attacks, with lower-end weapons and drones not only closing with targets themselves, but collectively dramatically increasing the chances of success for the higher end and stealthier missiles. Now, I've mentioned drones a few times now in relation to Rapid Dragon for good reason. Several of the new low-cost cruise missiles on the market are also being sold as single-use drones. Again, because to some extent they're sort of the same thing. Lockheed Martin's Common Multi-Mission Truck, or Comet, I've referenced a few times already, Anduril's Barracuda line, even Raytheon's ADM-160 miniature air-launched decoy, and others are all headed to market with interchangeable payload modules. That means your armed missiles can be accompanied by drones with other capabilities, like the MAL-J, which carries a signature augmentation subsystem that allows it to broadcast the radar return of just about any aircraft you can imagine, presenting the radar signatures of inbound F-15E Strike Eagles or even B-52 bombers, and forcing air defenses to prioritize them for engagement. The MAL-J also carries an onboard jammer to make that targeting effort all the more difficult. Other systems, like Comet, can carry ISR equipment to identify target sets, while still others carry explosive payloads to engage them. Meanwhile, higher-end weapons like the JASSM-ER could be closing with strategically vital targets amid the fray, and LRASMs could be hunting for and sinking warships participating in that air defense effort. It would be like trying to fight a swarm of hornets, except some of those hornets can disguise themselves as a guy throwing a punch or a pickup truck that's about to run you over, while others are practically invisible, and most of the ones that you do manage to see and swat were really just there to keep you from swatting at the meaner ones. And while tens of thousands of low-cost kamikaze drones on a nearby island chain, for instance, could be very handy in a similar offensive, it is important to keep in mind that those launch locations would be generally known, at least to some extent, by adversary forces that would be actively planning to mitigate them. Launches from aircraft, on the other hand, can come from any vector, making defensive planning a lot more difficult. But despite the promise of this approach, I want to be clear that there is no such thing as a warfare panacea. There is not one weapon system, or one drone, or one fighter jet that can fight and win a war by itself. The only real way to win a large-scale conflict is to fight with a sound overarching strategy that's built on effectively leveraging the weapons and the tactics and the personnel that you've got. And every commander in theater certainly wouldn't mind having more or maybe better versions of all three. Low-cost kamikaze drones, like the Shahed 136, could be a very handy part of a broader hornet's nest strategy, soaking up air defense interceptors and striking targets as an even lower-end addendum to the existing high-low mix. My biggest point in this regard, then, is really just that kamikaze drones are not the only way to achieve this effect, and indeed, depending on the circumstances, aren't even the most cost-effective or the least logistically taxing. After all, it might be cheap to produce Shahed 136-like drones, but they are still one-time use weapons, at least, for the most part. And that means you need to be shipping in thousands of replacement drones every time you use them, each of which measure more than 11 feet long and are more than 8 feet wide. And again, you need new shipments after every offensive. Now, most low-cost cruise missiles, like Lockheed's Comet, are around 8 feet long, and while their diameters have mostly not been disclosed, we do know that at least the Comet munition is meant to be carried internally by the F-35. And because the F-35 is capable of carrying weapons as large as the GBU-31 2,000-pound bomb, which has a diameter of just over 18 inches, we can assume that Comet has a diameter of 18 inches or less, at least while its wings are still folded. And that's almost enough information for us to start doing some simple back-of-the-envelope math. If we know the biggest possible diameter for a low-cost cruise missile like Comet is about 18 inches, we can get a rough sense of the difference in logistical strain for replenishment between these cruise missiles and larger kamikaze drones. Based on open-sourced images of the Shahed 136, it appears to have a total height of right around 17.7 inches, and that will be important for further math. Now, Lockheed Martin's C-130J Super Hercules has a cargo floor that is 55 feet long, 10 feet wide, and 9 feet tall, and by using these rough estimates and some sloppy arithmetic, we can determine that a single C-130J could deliver maybe 30 Shahed-sized drones in 5 rows of 6, crammed very tightly into that cargo hold. But the same aircraft could deliver between 216 and 220 Comet-sized missiles, or maybe even more if they have a diameter that's smaller than 18 inches. Of course, not all resupply missions would be carried out by C-130, but this offers us a relative understanding of the differences in logistical strain, 30 weapons versus 200 or more. But, of course, in order for low-cost cruise missiles like Comet or Anduril's Barracuda and others to meet the needs of the force, well, that means their production really does need to be easily and sustainably scalable, as these firms have promised. With defense expenditures as large as America's, production capacity may be even more important than unit cost. And while firms like Anduril, Lockheed Martin, and more have touted their ability to rapidly scale manufacturing to surge weapons production when needed, no firm has demonstrated that capability in a practical way just yet, especially amid what is certain to be vastly disrupted supply chains if large-scale war were to actually break out. And that's why, to be honest, choosing between kamikaze drones or low-cost cruise missiles may not be as important as just getting production started as soon as possible to begin to mass strategically useful numbers of whatever low-cost long-range weapon systems are on the menu. Because it doesn't matter how good your missiles are after you've run out of them. As is nearly always the case, the best possible option would, of course, be to start pumping out both super cheap kamikaze drone cruise missiles like the Shahed 136 and slightly less cheap cruise missiles like Comet or Barracuda, while also continuing to pump out high-end new fighter jets, bombers, ICBMs, submarines, satellites, and the like. But engaging with budget reality means needing to choose the systems that can get the job done without cannibalizing the budget needed for those other capabilities. And that, as always, means having to accept an imperfect solution. With the largest air power apparatus in the world and the means to produce much more capable weapons than Shahed-style drones for what is still a relatively low cost, especially as a percentage of America's defense spending power, it stands to reason that it just makes more sense to focus on air-launched standoff weapons like low-cost cruise missiles than on ground-launched kamikaze drones, even if they can offer greater ranges and lower per-unit prices. But on a long enough timeline, the differences between these systems will likewise begin to blur, until we see drones and missiles as more akin to different calibers of ammunition, with modular variety making it possible to tailor your attack for efficiency and efficacy across a wide array of platforms and costs. But we do need to balance our ability to fight today against our aspirations for how we'll fight tomorrow. And for my tax dollar, I would consider low-cost cruise missiles to be a vital capability that we need to be pumping out right now. And then fielding cheaper Kamikaze drone-style cruise missiles, along with the necessary training pipelines and launch infrastructure, as a slightly longer-term goal. But that's the thing about these kinds of conversations. My take on this topic isn't a conclusion, it's just one part of a larger conversation. There's really no way to know what the right answer is until the next fight is already well underway. But by pulling from lots of different perspectives, we can work toward forming a pretty practical conclusion together. So I want to hear from you. What do you think promises to offer the more potent addition to America's force projection capabilities, especially in places like the Pacific? Cheap cruise missiles or even cheaper kamikaze drones? The best answer is, of course, to do both, but let's pretend you have to pick just one, because there's a solid possibility that's the position defense planners will find themselves in as well. And with that, ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and now merch from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and don't forget to leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And while you're down there, make sure to click on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.